It is my pleasure on behalf of the Executive Committee of Left Forum to welcome you all. Left Forum is a unique phenomenon in the U.S. and the world, and that it convenes the largest annual conference of a broad spectrum of left and progressive individuals and intellectuals, academics, organizations, and interested participants in a public gathering. The conference participants come together to engage in a wide range of critical perspectives on the world to discuss differences, commonalities, alternatives to current predicaments, and to share ideas of understanding and transforming the world. The conference is held each year in New York City. This year we have some 1,200 speakers and some 400 panels that will take place over the weekend between now and Sunday evening. Folks come from all over the world to come to this conference, and before I move forward, I want to really give a big round of applause, or I hear a big round of applause for Seth Adler. We have one paid staff person on the Left Forum, and Seth puts all of this together every year, and there is just this incredible war room that goes on 365 days a year up at the City University of New York Graduate Center, where the Left Forum offices are housed. And Seth is kind of there 6 days a week pulling out his hair, and every now and then I stop by to kind of pep him up, hold him up. But there's also an incredible group of volunteers, and all of those folks that you saw downstairs at the check-in tables and sign-ins and leading you are all volunteers. I also want to give a shout out to Tom Ngati. Tom Ngati is the director of the Center for Urban Policy and Planning at Hunter College at the City University of New York. And Tom is also with the Progressive Planners Network, and they have their own conference going on this weekend at the same time that Left Forum is going on. Last night I spoke at the opening of the Planners Network Conference after a film screening of the film My Brooklyn, which really goes into detail about the gentrification taking place in downtown Brooklyn. Any of you from New York know the Fulton Mall area of Brooklyn was considered the third busiest shopping center in New York, and next to Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue. And our elected officials and the power brokers decided that it needed to change, right? The hell with the people down there, it just needed to change. So the film documents that, and it does so in a good way. With this year's Left Forum, we have some great plenaries. Christian Perenni, Jill Stein, and Emmanuel Wallerstein, along with Left Forum board member Nancy Holstrom will be here tonight. Noam Chomsky tomorrow afternoon in a special event. Tomorrow evening's plenary has Oliver Stone, Bill Fletcher, and Greg Wilpert, along with Donna Murch, another Left Forum board member. Sunday afternoon we have a very special event with a report from Greece, and many members of the Greece Parliament will be here. And we close out the plenary with Bolivian Vice President Alvaro Garcia Linera, John Bellamy Fawcett, and Tadzio Muller, along with Catherine Mulder, who is also a member of the Left Forum board. So with that, we were hoping our facilitator hasn't arrived yet. I thought the person was in town, so I'm going to move this program forward. Our facilitator and speakers, we have many speakers on our panel tonight. I'll start all the way on the far left with Baltimore Right to Housing. I'm going to have the folks introduce themselves. We, Max and myself, as Take Back the Land Leadership Committee folks, have a relationship with all of the folks that you're going to see on tonight's panel, and we think the way they do their work truly transforms the way we look at housing and land. And that's the way we see the work of Take Back the Land. So we'll start on my far left and ask the panelists to introduce themselves and come across. Give me your name, your organization, and just quickly how long you've been doing this work.
Hello, hi. My name is Detrese Dowridge with Right to Housing Alliance in Baltimore City. And I've just actually joined this organization for about a month.
I'm Jessica Lewis, I'm an organizer with the Right to Housing Alliance. We've been doing this work since December 2011.
I'm Chandra, Bhatnagar. I'm a senior attorney with the Human Rights Program at the ACLU. I've been an organizer and then attorney for about 17 years.
My name is Fleming, co-founder of the Chicago Anti-Eviction campaign, local action group with Take Back the Land. I've been organizing for about 20 years, 4 years with the Anti-Eviction campaign, 15 years in housing.
My name is Max Rameau, and I'm with Take Back the Land. I've been with Take Back the Land since 2006.
So before I ask Max to come up here and join me, I don't know if any of you read this past Sunday's New York Times. magazine section. Two of the stars of that magazine section are members of the Chicago Anti-Eviction campaign. J.R. Fleming, step up, stand up. You know you guys be doing big time work if the New York Times features you in their magazine section. So props to my brothers from Chi-Town. I'm going to ask Max to come up now, and many of you know we've been advertising this as sunsetting the Take Back the Land movement, and you know everybody wants to know what sunset means. That means we're putting Take Back the Land to rest. A little tough to say, right? It's been a part of what we've both been doing for a long time. Myself 4 years, and Max for the better part of 7, 8 years. In 2009, March of 2009, I had an opportunity as a member of Picture the Homeless to travel down to Miami and learn from this incredible organization. And we were, at the time in Picture the Homeless, we were trying to figure out how to move a piece of legislation that would effectively have the city doing a vacant building count, because we thought there was a paradigm problem with homeless people sleeping on the street and large numbers of vacant buildings existing around the city. And we wanted to change that dynamic. And you know, we kept sitting down and talking with the city, and they kept discounting whether or not there were vacant spaces or not. So we found a way, we started looking for radical ways to get our point across. And we came across the work that was happening in Miami at the time. Take Back the Land had just come off of Rameau Village, where they had vacated a piece of property in central Miami, and had taken that piece of property and made it available to people who were homeless on the streets, and figured out a way that that piece of land could serve the community, and the community could control it. So in March 2009, myself, 3 other members went down to Miami, learned from what Take Back the Land was doing, and it was an incredible transformation for me personally, I think, as well as the other Take Back the Land members. We actually, well, I'll start off first. You heard a piece in the video from the Trody family, who was featured in Michael Moore's film, Capitalism, A Love Story. And Max took me to meet Mary Trody and the rest of the family. And at the time, I recorded a piece of audio for her. I do a radio show here in New York called Global Movements, Urban Struggles. And Max left us alone in the room, and I had a very personal conversation with Mary about what it meant to have that home liberated to her. And it was something that just affected me in a way that I just can't explain. It transformed me, it humanized, really put a human face to the struggle and what people were going to. And Mary was very open to me. She said, Bob, this isn't a beautiful place to some. It's probably a hole in the wall to a lot of people, but it was our home, and we appreciate living here. And she was so grateful for what Max did, and I realized how powerful that was and what that meant to Mary. The other part was we actually moved a family in a house in Miami and participated in that process, right? I had never done anything like that before, and it just got your adrenaline flowing to a certain degree. And I came back, and you know, I hit the ground in New York, and I came back to Picture the Home and said, we got to take over a piece of property. That's it, you know. And in 2 weeks, we went up to 116th Street and Madison Avenue and took over a vacant building. First time anybody had done it in New York City in a number of years. And it sort of radicalized, energized, and just really brought this issue to the forefront. So it was very moving, but you know, that formed a relationship between Max and myself, and that relationship continued through 2009. I was fortunate enough to be able to work with the City University of New York Center for Place, Culture and Politics, which was run by David Harvey and Neil Smith at the time, and be able to bring Max up to New York for a couple of his speaking engagements. We spoke together at the Grad Center, we spoke together at Brecht Forum, and really started to form a bond. And Max became this incredible mentor to me, right? And I started to learn about the different processes and what this struggle meant, and years of racism and problems, and why community control of land was so important, right? And it really started to radicalize me and politicize me in a way that I never thought would change me the way it did, but it was fantastic. So I think the next thing that really just pushed us out and started thinking about how we move this work from Miami and make it broader. Max and I had the opportunity to speak together. We have folks here from Baltimore at a conference called The City from Below in Baltimore in 2009. And we were on a panel with David Harvey, members of United Workers, Steve Meacham from City Life, Vita Urbana, Poverty Initiative members from here in New York. And it was called Radical Organizing in the 21st Century. And it was really folks who were just looking at this work different and really taking a militant stand towards the human right to housing, and it was very powerful. And it just really formed a bond. But we came away, Max and I started talking, what happens if we move this work along the East Coast? Steve Meacham and City Life are doing great eviction defense up in Boston. You know, Picture the Homeless is starting to do this work in New York, and they've been doing it in Miami for a while. So what does it look like nationally? Well, we continued to talk that summer, and then it ended up in September of 2009. We ended up Labor Day weekend in Atlanta at Kali Akuno, who is the director of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, invited us and a bunch of other folks in the movement down to his house in Atlanta, and that's where we launched Take Back the Land National with the call to action for May 10th, 2010. And it was incredible. We got some incredible actions in different cities, and especially in cities we didn't expect to have good actions in, right? I think Max and I both thought that we were going to have the great actions in all these urban centers, but it happened in places like Madison, Wisconsin, and Toledo, Ohio, with Keith Sadler and the foreclosure group in there, and in Portland, Oregon, places we didn't expect. But we actually lifted up stories of people all around the country. People became invigorated around this work. But we've gone through a lot of iterations of what Take Back the Land is. We've engaged local action groups. We supported the Chicago folks when they moved Martha Biggs, who was also featured in that article that I just mentioned. We supported those folks in Chicago. And I think JR will tell you that was also a time where you could see the adrenaline and what it meant to people to participate in this type of work and really exercise self-determination for social change, right? People were invigorated. People had never done it before, said this totally makes sense. And people came together and fought for it. But we think we've come together and we think we've missed a moment, right? I don't want to say missed a moment. We've lifted this work to a certain point, and it's kind of leveled off, right? And we didn't get it to a point that we thought it should be for a number of reasons, right? And instead of me laying out those reasons, I'd rather pay homage to Max, who taught me what I know to step up, and then just talk about that in a real way. So, Max, if you could just come up and talk about some of the reasons why.
First of all, thank everyone for coming out, and thank you again to the Left Forum for making this space available for us to have this discussion. So I want to go over two things here, spend a little bit of time talking about the decision to sunset Take Back the Land, and then focus and shift, and hopefully we'll spend a substantial amount of the panel time talking about what some of the next steps are. The next steps are for the movement, the next steps are for real hard left progressive work. So to start out with, just in terms of Take Back the Land and sunsetting. Take Back the Land started in the fall or late summer of 2006 in Miami, Florida, where the real estate boom was at its harshest, and that's what the media called it, was a real estate boom, and that's where the politicians wanted to think of it as. But for many communities, particularly communities of color, we experienced that as a gentrification, a period of gentrification, harsh gentrification. And I think it was the first national wave of gentrification that was happening. So it was happening in Miami, it's kind of like the epicenter. And so we really were creating in response to that. Take Back the Land, we won't go into all the elements here, but was a very specific response to a particular historic moment. And that historic moment was all of these, was the gentrification crisis, which is happening in extreme wave in low-income communities, immediately followed by exactly what we expected, which was a bust in the real estate bubble, and therefore all these foreclosures. We really expected to reach that level. But when it happened in Miami, then of course we began the process of identifying these vacant government-owned and foreclosed units, breaking into them, and as we say, moving homeless people into peopleless homes. So we started as a very particular and specific response to this historic moment, and therefore when that historic moment comes to a close, when people aren't thinking about things in the same way they were thinking about it before, then it seems to us that it makes sense to then close the response to that moment as well. So if we started out because there was this huge opportunity around this particular phenomenon, and then that phenomenon dissipates, or it's no longer around, or it's on its way down, then it doesn't make sense to continue to fight with the exact same response that we did to begin with. The thing that got us started was no longer there in the same way, so we can no longer respond to that in the same way Otherwise, we'll just be making a mistake and be banging our head up against the wall. So we even, when we first started talking about, building Take Back the Land, and when we ultimately built it, we even talked about automatically sunsetting over a certain amount of time. We ended up not doing that for a number of reasons. But we talked about, for example, in 5 years, pick a date, and at that time we would dissolve and all go out and start something new. That was not something that we wanted to do. So it was a very difficult decision, but it was a necessary decision, we feel, in order to move forward and to tackle the new challenges that are coming up. So I want to spend a few moments talking about just very briefly, a few of the lessons and observations that we have, and then again shift to to what we think is happening in the future. So in terms of the observations and things that we found, I want to talk about 3 of them. We had probably about 15 or 20 in all that we identified as observations, those things that prevented us from moving forward and just things that happened during this time. But just want to very quickly touch on 3. First is positive action. We talked about positive action and Take Back the Land quite a bit, and we developed a term. It is a continuation of a term created by Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of the Free Ghana, in which he talked about positive action as the things that we need to do in order to liberate and decolonialize Africa and liberate Africa. We talk about positive action as a escalation from civil disobedience. So if you think about direct action as engaging in these hardcore actions in order to express your unhappiness with the law, and you talk about civil disobedience as an escalation from that, and the civil disobedience is not just breaking any law, but it's breaking the specific law with which you have moral objection, that is civil disobedience. We talk about positive action as enforcing moral laws. Not just breaking immoral laws, which is civil disobedience, but enforcing moral laws. So we think the police evicting a family who's lost its job from their home because they don't have enough money to give a bank, we think that is immoral, and we feel we have a moral obligation to stand up and fight against that. But not only that, do we have a right to civilly disobey those immoral laws, the imposition of those immoral laws, but we also have an obligation to implement moral laws. We also think it's immoral to have homeless people on the street and empty houses on the other side of the street. So we not only have an obligation to prevent evictions from happening, but we also have an obligation to take the people who are living on the street and move them into the houses that are sitting there serving no social good. So we talked about positive action. We exercised it. It was not only an escalation, but it was a real tangible way to build a movement by getting people actively involved in their own liberation and in their own struggle and taking their liberation in their own hands. In addition, as mentioned, it helped us implement our own public policy. And those were the kind of the theories behind why we did it. We wanted to implement our own public policy, we wanted to help build a movement, spark a movement by engaging in these powerful actions. But it was another thing that we discovered while doing this. We had a eviction defense that we launched in Rochester, New York, the Take Back the Land Rochester. A woman named Catherine Lennon, her husband died of brain cancer. He was the main breadwinner. After he died, they were unable to pay she was unable to pay the mortgage. He did not leave a will, and she was unable to pay the mortgage, and she was foreclosed on, and they were getting ready to evict her. So Take Back the Land Rochester organized around her, organized the community, and launched an eviction defense. And for 2 weeks straight, while the eviction period was open in Rochester, they sat in front of the door from, I think it's 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., whenever it's legally allowed in New York City, to do evictions, and they prevented the police from doing eviction. The police would drive by, see them all there, they'd have cameras, etc., and then the police would drive off. 2 weeks and 1 day later, the police came with a SWAT team. And SWAT team, something like 15 police cars, and full geared out SWAT team, semi-automatic weapons, and moved us out, arrested, I think it was 6 of us and 1 neighbor, and evicted Captain Lennon from her home at gunpoint. And so obviously she was out of the house, and she ended up couch surfing for the next few months, trying to get herself together. They made a lot of media attention, got a lot of media attention, and then after that, there was no real motion, even though it got media attention, even though elected officials got involved, there was no real motion on the negotiation with the bank to try to get her back in the home. So we did the only thing that we felt at that point was the natural thing to do, is we broke back into the house and moved her back in. And this was about 3 months or so after she was evicted and working. So not that long after we did that, they realized they were unable to evict her, and the bank offered her a new mortgage. And this is the first, I think, time, this is, of course, now it's ubiquitous. Everyone is getting new mortgages and principal reduction. But I think this was the first time someone had gotten a new mortgage post post-foreclosure, post-eviction, and post showing up on television saying we're breaking back into the house. And we practically did it on live TV. So what we concluded is that we had all the theories about when we do positive action, but what engaging in positive action campaigns demonstrated to us is that the law is for suckers. The really powerful and really wealthy don't have to pay attention to it, and those communities that are really well organized also don't have to pay attention to it. And them saying to us that, well, you can't have this house because you were foreclosed on, you didn't sign this paperwork, didn't mean anything, because if we could muster up enough power, we could actually do exactly what we wanted to do, and that's what we did. So that was a positive action. A couple statements on the nonprofit industrial complex. Take Back the Land made a deliberate decision not to become a 501c3, and we did so because we felt like we had too great a number of our social justice forces in the 501c3 industrial complex. And what that did was that while on the one hand it professionalized a lot of the organizing that happened, it also prevented those who were in that space from exercising their full range of creativity. For two reasons. One is when you get a 501c3, you kind of make a deal with the government where they say, okay, we're going to give you nonprofit tax-free status, but in exchange, you're not allowed to break the law, you agree that you're not going to break the law, and you agree that you're never going to challenge us for power, which means you can't run anyone for office, you can't support anyone for office, et cetera. And that's the deal that's made, which, you know, in some cases you can say that's not a bad deal, but either way, it's a deal. We don't think in terms of advancing social justice that we can have all of our forces in that segment of the movement. That's an important segment, certainly not some blind side on 501c3s. I work for one, I get my paycheck for one. All of us in the leadership development, in the leadership of Take Back the Land, have relationships with and work for nonprofit organizations. But it is a problem, we think, to have all of our forces in the 501c3 industrial complex. Out of this time, we have found, and certainly that's been made valid by Occupy, we must have segments of this movement that are not in the 501c3 industrial complex. It gives more power to those who are there, and it gives us a broader range of political activity in which we can participate. In addition, we don't have the other problem of funders, of people who have a lot of money who we are often protesting, putting money out in a trail that drives us away from where we actually want to go. We actually think that this plays a significant role in why we felt like the time came to Take Back the Land to sunset. If you remember last year, about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, it was the winter of 2012. There were all kinds of expectations. Occupy was still going in some way, shape, or form. And there were all kinds of things happening. Everyone was expecting there to be a spring and summer to remember with eviction defenses happening all over the country. We were expecting land liberation to happen. We expected spring, remember there was supposed to be the 99% spring and there's all these things going on. People were expecting a huge spring and a long hot summer, and it frankly fizzled. And we saw that happening in real time. And right around the fall, at some point it occurred to us what had happened is that all of those forces that were in the 501c3 industrial complex were doing 501c3s and C4s, and they were doing re-elect Obama work. And so we had this hardcore group of people who were radicalized by Occupy, who were getting some political theory from Occupy, political theory from Take Back the Land, political theory from everywhere else, who are now ready to engage in actions that people haven't engaged in this country in a long, long time. And instead of engaging in those actions, we were all told to go door to door and get Obama reelected. And that's what there was funding and money for. We lost a huge historic moment and a historic opportunity here. And we think that's substantially because of the way the 501c3 industrial complex is set up. And again, there's not some blind side on 501c3s. We have them, we work for them, we work with them. But we need to figure out a better way of more holistically developing movements that don't depend on that kind of funding and can't be so easily distracted from our purpose and our mission. Last thing on the observations, we think that this is a time in history. Even though this particular moment we think the window is closing, there are other windows that are opening up, and this time still generally is a time for us to make advancements. We think we, as a movement, must be way more ambitious in our reach and in our objectives and in our vision than we have been as of late. With the recent actions that happened last year around eviction defenses and continue to happen around eviction defenses in particular, we have, for the first time, hundreds and thousands, literally, of people who are going out doing eviction defenses, who are going out and blocking the street, who are going out and protesting banks and doing all kinds of amazing, amazing work and incredible actions. And then when the media comes and when those in power come and they say, okay, what are your demands? The only thing we're seen to be able to muster is, we want this person who owed all kinds of money to get a brand new mortgage from the bank, and we want them to pay the bank back, although we want the mortgage to be at a reduced rate. We cannot build a movement, we assert, based on the idea that people get principal reduction, or somehow we have a movement that's based on preserving people's equity in their home ownership. We can't build a movement based on that. We can build a movement on the human right to housing. We can build a movement on community control over land, but we can't build a movement based on principal reduction for a number of reasons. In addition, I think just on a practical level, I think it's bound to happen, and it's going to upset a lot of people. We're going to have a massive eviction offense for a family. People are going to get out, get arrested. The family's going to get to stay. They're going to get a new mortgage. They're going to get $100,000, $200,000 knocked off on their mortgage. And then the economy's going to pick back up, and they're going to flip the house and make $100,000 off it. And then what are people going to say? Not only does it look like the family got over on the movement, or took advantage of the movement in order to make $100,000, but then the movement didn't even have the side benefit of creating affordable housing, because that family still got rich by overcharging another family $100,000 for the same housing. We cannot build a movement based on small and short-thinking goals. We have to reach for the most ambitious goals we could possibly have. We need to be reaching for the human right to housing realized in the United States in our lifetime, and we need to be reaching for community control over land in the United States. So in terms of the future, we'll wrap up and we'll get to the panel. Hopefully we have Eric say a few words. We don't think of this as a end, but as a transition from one historic moment into another historic moment. So the question for us is not should Take Back the Land stay around forever, or what should we do next? We don't want to go through the trouble of trying to reinvent ourselves every 2 or 3 years to remain relevant. We want to instead focus on doing the work that we are supposed to be doing. So what is happening next? You know, one of the scenes that I remember most vividly, way before Take Back, not way before, when Take Back the Land started, was, well, we were already around at this point, but when we started to go national, was during the 2008 presidential election, when it was clear the economy was about to collapse. And Obama and McCain both took time off of their campaign schedule to go back to Washington to do their dog and pony show. And they were meeting behind closed doors in order to save the world economy, supposedly. And we all know what came out of that. But what stuck with me most was not only just the general sense of panic that was, you know, people who were near retirement age, my family members were worried that their entire retirement savings would be wiped out, but how silent the left was. We were there collectively hoping that Barack Obama, then a candidate, not even president, would somehow be able to come in and save the day and make sure that he takes care of the economy and save us all. The left was not out on the street. We were not making any visible demands. We were caught completely and totally flat-footed in the biggest, potentially the biggest economic crisis of our lifetime. We're completely and totally flat-footed. We cannot be put in that position again. So as we discussed what happened then and the way that the crisis was covered up, one thing that we used to say a lot was, and still do, was that it seemed like as a result of the real estate bust, there was this big gigantic crater in the economy, at least in the real estate economy. A $700 billion, that's the official number they gave, of course we know it was more, but $700 billion crater that was there that was destroying the economy. You couldn't drive over it, you would sink in, you couldn't get around it, it was too wide, it was gigantic. And that crater was covered up with TARP money, with $700 billion of public money. It was just filled up with, instead of dirt, it just filled it up with cash and flattened out the road so people could use it again. And it stabilized that part of the economy. And so as we talked about this with academics and with economists, you know, I said, well, look, it looks like they're going to stabilize this thing. And here's this historic moment. We're going to lose this historic moment because they basically filled up this thing with cash instead of with dirt. And what particularly the late, great Neil Smith pointed out, but a few others did also, was that they didn't materialize this dirt that they filled up this huge crater with, this crater which was very real, this hole. They didn't just materialize, they didn't invent it, they didn't manufacture it in a lab. They had to take it from somewhere. And where they took it out of was the public sector. They took $700 billion worth of dirt or cash or whatever it was, you know, to fill up that crater on this side by removing it from that side. Which suggests then that the next major crisis we're going to experience is going to come because of a shortfall happening on the public sector, not the private sector. This closing of schools that's happening all over the United States, closing of rec centers, is just a forewarning, we think, of what the next crisis is going to be. We must be better prepared. We have to position ourselves today to deal with, make demands around, and organize around the crisis which comes tomorrow. Thank you.
So, thank you, Max. You heard Max mention Neil Smith. Neil Smith was one of those academics that was truly a friend of Take Back the Lands. He passed away last fall, and he was really tight with Max and myself, and always made his class and his students available to us. A lot of research was done through Neil's teaching. So, you know, I think Max and I both think that we definitely miss Neil Smith, and you know, may he rest in peace. It's time now to hear from a great group of panelists that we have, but that panel will be facilitated or moderated by Eric Mann, who's a veteran of the Congress of Racial Equality and Students for a Democratic Society and the United Auto Workers. He is the director of the Labor and Community Strategy Center in Los Angeles, and he hosts KPFK's Voices from the Front Lines on Pacifica Los Angeles, and the author of Playbooks for the Progressives, 16 Qualities of a Successful Organizer. He is also a regular here at Left Forum, so let's give a round of applause for Eric.
Hi everybody. So my understanding of how this panel is going to go is I'm going to speak for 5 minutes and just give some overview responses, actually real segue from Max's last presentation to actually try to address some of the questions that he raised, and then to introduce the other panelists, all of whom will be speak for 5 minutes, is my understanding, about what they're doing, that's trying to speak into the text of transformative organizing, and then we're going to throw it open to the group for a conversation. Is that my understanding of the game plan? Okay. What's interesting is almost on cue, Max and I have known each other for a long time. Leave it? Okay. I want to talk to you about a new campaign that's coming out of the Labor Community Strategy Center called the Fight for the Soul of the Cities. That literally is the next sentence after Max's presentation. Because for those of you who know the Strategy Center, we're now going into, if you can imagine, our 25th year. And more importantly than that, we're growing faster than we were in our first, second, 11th, 13th, and 19th year. And we've just initiated this new campaign called the Fight for the Soul of the Cities. And if I had my t-shirts, it would say an international vision for urban organizing. And I want to explain to you what it's about by laying out the idea that it begins by trying to explain what we call counter-hegemonic demand development, and that you build a movement around very big picture demands that are beyond individual demands that begin to put together the kind of world you want to have, but also the kind of world against which you want to organize, because I do believe you organize against things in order to get things you want. In particular, you organize against U.S. imperialism as the main danger at this point in history. So the fight for the soul of cities begins with one frame, which we call the anti-racist, anti-imperialist united front. And what we mean by that is all over the world today, there are three basic structural problems: racism, imperialism, and I would argue ecological destruction that almost supersedes the other two contradictions, because it's moving at such a rapid rate that if we do not address the ecological destruction of the world, the anti-racist, anti-imperialist project is on a timeline set by nature, which in return is on a timeline set by the production and consumption of the advanced Western world that is literally going to say where Christianity and Marxism finally both agree that the world is coming to an end, but with a different perspective. Marx said that we would either have socialism or a common ruin, and all those in favor of socialism and all those in favor of a common ruin, I don't think we have to vote. So in Los Angeles, we're trying to build a national and international organization. We call it a movement-building campaign, and it's called the Fight for the Soul of Cities. That's framed by the social welfare state, not the police state, the environmental justice state, not the warfare state. Under that is framed by some very key structural demands. Free the U.S. 2.5 million prisoners, and in fact, that number is up to really free the U.S. 7 million, 10 million, 20 million, if you count all the people on probation, all the people on parole, and all the families absolutely pulled into the mass incarceration of black and Latino communities. Then on the other hand, we have no cars, no aid, which is a very serious demand that I'll tell you about if you can come to our workshop tomorrow at 5, then I'll give you the information where we're going to go into great detail about that. But no cars, no aid is ironically a very winnable and very utopian mass demand. What's it going to take to get 8 million cars off the road in Los Angeles? A revolution, but a revolution that's possible. I'll get to that in a minute. Another one of our demands is open borders and amnesty for all immigrants. Is it possible to open the borders? Absolutely. Is it possible to give amnesty to all immigrants? Absolutely. Another one of our demands is 5,000 zero-emission buses and free public transportation. Is free public transportation historically possible? Absolutely. It goes back to, though, the fight for the social welfare state, not the police state, and the environmental justice state, not the warfare state. It's a class struggle over the state. It is, in fact, a struggle over the state. Then we have a demand of no U.S. drone attacks. Obviously, it's far deeper than that, but the drone is actually a symbol and a reality of just a further degradation of U.S. imperialism. Each time from it's the atom bomb to saturation bombing to Agent Orange and now to the drone is the highest level of dehumanization of a capitalist system where the President of the United States literally sits down with somebody and says, I think we're going to kill this person in this country and all the collateral damage around them, violate the sovereignty of everybody in the world, and we think we have the power and the right to do it. It's so fundamentally unethical that it can lead to a revolution against a system that declares itself openly to be so unethical. We also think what's interesting about organizing is we also have a slogan, 1,000 more buses, 1,000 more teachers, 1,000 more counselors, 1,000 more nurses, and 1,000 less police. Is there anything that I have said so far that you did not understand? There's nothing anybody in LA doesn't understand. If you go up on the buses or in the high schools and say, free the U.S. 2.5 million prisoners, everybody knows what that means. The debate now goes to, do we want that? That's the debate. And when we get to free public transportation, we get to Max's point about housing as a human right, because we're starting to move into, so far we're in a very reformist mode. We're simply saying the very lowest cost, highest quality, highest aesthetic value, publicly funded transportation, which is based on, of course, housing being a human right. So the way people are going to perceive it is, so let me understand it. So all these immigrants are going to be running free. All these prisoners are going to be running free, and you're going to lock up my car. I'm going to say, exactly. Exactly. You got it. And that's the conversation we need to have in the United States at that level right now. Fight for the Solar Cities is not trying to build a national organization. It's called a national movement building campaign. What we mean by that is we're building our movement in Los Angeles, but we're going to Detroit, to Philly, to Chicago, to Miami, to talk to other organizers, because we have a lot of credibility with organizers in our field. You build it on the ground. If you build it on the ground, other people will look. If your experiment fails, don't run around the country pushing it to somebody else. If your experiment is doing well, everybody wants to hear about it. And right now, frankly, it's doing incredibly well, and I'll tell you more about it tomorrow at 5. So I think we're in a period right now where the socialist project, the left project, is to me on probation. I don't think the left has any moral authority to tell anybody what it wants. If it can't organize its way out of a paper bag, if it can't build a base on the ground in black and Latino communities, the word socialism to me has no valence to me. I'm for certain socialisms and against others. I'm for the socialism of the South African Communist Party. I'm against the socialism of all the social democratic parties that started World War I. I'm for the socialism of the Communist Party that built the AFL-CIO and stood up for the Scottsboro Boys. I'm against the socialism of the Communist Party that told me when I got involved in the anti-war movement that we should have negotiations now and not call for immediate withdrawal from Vietnam because that was too radical. So I think socialism and the left is not my point of reference. It's not the point of reference of young Black and Latino kids today. Revolution is, interestingly. So the question is, can the left and the socialists catch up to the revolution rather than discuss how they're going to lead it? So in that context, it's great to be here, and let's introduce some folks. I'm assuming that no one has spoken except you, Rob. Is that correct?
Well, they've introduced themselves. You can just go right down the sheet.
All right. Chandra, Bhatnagar, would you like to come on up? Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. All right. I want to begin by thanking Rob and Max and Take Back the Land for inviting me to join all of you here this afternoon. It's truly an honor to be part of this distinguished panel. And while we're here to discuss challenges that we face and moving forward, I think it's also really important that recognizing the sunset of the Take Back the Land movement, I think it's really important to reflect on what a revolutionary and historic period of time and action and movement this was and represents. And so we didn't really have a round of applause at the conclusion of Max's and Rob's presentation, but I just want to take a moment right now for all of us to kind of congratulate them for all their work and all the other folks involved as part of it. So we've heard a little bit about, I'm going to be speaking about where do lawyers support this and not detract from all of this work? How does law interact with social movements, and how can we as attorneys support activism and struggles for justice? We heard the term human rights thrown around, but I just want to be clear, when we say human rights, what do we mean? Human rights at their most essential form are the rights entitled to all people simply by virtue of their humanity. They are the rights entitled to all people simply by virtue of their humanity. Now, these rights are enshrined in international treaties, some of which the U.S. has signed and ratified, some of which it hasn't. But most importantly, these rights are owed to you because of your personhood. And these rights are owed to you regardless of your race, color, religion, gender, national, ethnic origin, social status, immigration status, immigration status, immigration status, or any other status. So why do human rights matter to our work in support of social justice? There's a historical precedent for all of this. Our foremothers and forefathers in the struggle for social justice called for using human rights strategies to advance domestic justice in the U.S. Malcolm X, Abizar Campos, W.B. Du Bois, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Roger Baldwin, the founder of the ACLU. These are just some of the voices that called for taking injustice here in the world stage and having a higher level of standards of protection that we seek to assert domestically. But it's not just leaders, it's not just civil rights leaders that took part in actions that were themselves asserting human rights. So when we see folks in Take Back the Land, liberating a house and saying housing is a human right, it's my right to be here, there's a historical predicate for that. And as Malcolm said, of all sciences, history is best qualified to reward all research. The last action that Dr. King was part of before he was assassinated was the Memphis sanitation workers' strike. Those of you who are old enough to take part in this or be aware of it, or those who are younger, you might see the images from Eyes on the Prize, these beautiful scenes of very dignified African-American men holding up signs that says, "I am a man. I am a man." What is that? That is a call for personhood. That is a call asserting your fundamental human rights. And that's the same call that's being kind of put forward today in support of housing, in support of the right to education, a lot of the economic and social rights that are kind of ignored or marginalized by this government and by the kind of imperialist regime that exists globally. So in my experience, lawyers and communities are beginning now in the U.S. to kind of use human rights in support of their broad organizing. And part of the reason for that is that you don't need to have an advanced degree to engage in human rights. In fact, if you look globally, leaders of human rights movements are indigenous peoples, LGBT folks, women, young people, those incarcerated. These are the people that are leading global movements for rights, and you can engage in these mechanisms without having fancy degrees or whatever it might be. But at its most core level, law can be a kind of a legitimizing tool of inequality. And so if you look, again, and history is our guide, I had 2 examples I always like to cite. Nelson Mandela had a lot of you. You don't liberate South Africa from apartheid and oppression through the South African legal system. Mahatma Gandhi had a lot of you. You don't free India from British colonialism through the British legal system. You can use your legal skills to get your comrades out of jail after they've been locked up. You might be able to use some strategy or here and there. But you need a movement. It's the people that will move the ball forward towards acquiring justice or a greater form of justice. And lawyers can be important tools in support of that, but it's the movement that has to lead. So as lawyers, we have to recognize the limitation of our profession, but we also have to utilize the privilege of our profession in support of that movement. And we can work to defend the rights of the accused, we can work in support of broader movement, but unless that's done with the folks on the ground driving the bus, unless the strategy is being formulated and kind of articulated, the architecture is being built by those who are most affected, it ends up reifying privilege, it ends up reifying inequality, and you have kind of big, well-funded national kind of civil rights or human rights organizations parachuting in, telling local folks how they need to do stuff, and then leaving. And then the people on the ground have to pick up the pieces. So that's not an effective strategy moving forward. It's not moral, it's not ethical, and it's not going to bring about the kind of change that all of us are interested in. So, I've also seen, it's not simply a law issue, I've also seen professional, as this was mentioned earlier, I've also seen professional organizers or professional folks who come into community, who are going to help organize the people and figure out what they need to do, form the same, it's not simply a law issue. I've seen organizers assert the same level of privilege, professional organizers, and try to help people get their stuff together, and that's similarly flawed and similarly problematic. And so I think what we need to do is we need to really take a step backward and look at where communities are and look at where the people want to go and form models like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, where it's the workers that began that organization. It's the workers that drove the bus and continue to drive the bus, and there are lawyers and there are allies and there are other people who support that organization, who support the work that they do, but they do so cognizant of the fact that it's the organization that's creating the agenda for how they're going to move forward. And when communities are organized, there are remarkable victories that can be achieved. I share with you one example. I partnered with a community in Puerto Rico of primarily Dominican migrants who were living, squatting on an area of land that had been abandoned. They built it up from nothing, and it was a thriving kind of working class community with about 300 families, 200 children, primarily single women-headed households, and they were a suburb of San Juan. So the women would travel into San Juan, work, and then come back to their community. Now, the rumor on the ground was that Donald Trump wanted to build a golf course on this land. And literally can't make this stuff up. And what we do know is the police showed up and basically said, everyone, you have to leave. And the community said that we will not be moved. And they held fast. The police came back with heavy equipment, bulldozers, used tear gas, beat some of the elderly people that lived there. A pregnant woman was struck in the belly, had like a 6-hour siege to forcibly remove this community. The community stayed organized, non-violently resisted, and somehow stayed on that property. But the next step, and this is the prior governor of Puerto Rico, the next step of the governor, we're going to smoke them out. They cut off the water and the electricity to this community. This is at a time when H1N1 virus is running rampant around Puerto Rico. So you don't have running water, you can't wash your hands. What do? You have to collect water from rainwater in vats. They have these big plastic vats collecting rainwater, but dengue fever is also running rampant around Puerto Rico. So mosquitoes are hatching eggs on the top of this water, and unsurprisingly, people are getting dengue fever in the community, and 2 people almost died, and then an infant contracted H1N1 and almost died. Thankfully, no one did, but it was simply a matter of time until this became a really serious, kind of a fatal situation. So we at the ACLU of Puerto Rico, Human Rights Clinic at Washington University, we worked with this community. We met with folks that were locally organizing there, and they had exhausted all their domestic kind of legal options in the Puerto Rican courts, which are pretty Byzantine if anybody's ever interacted in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico courts, and decided, well, we're going to do a human rights appeal to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, complete like Hail Mary, you know, long shot. Nobody really thinks it's going to have any impact. But because the folks organized locally were so strong and so committed, we were like, well, we'll try it. So, met with a reporter from the Associated Press before we filed the brief. Gave him access to the community. He met with folks there. He took pictures of people bathing in an industrial canal because there was nothing else to do. People that were taking water from the canal and putting bleach in it to try to like clean it and then use it for home cooking and other things. And it was just a terrible situation. Wrote an article. He had an embargoed copy of the brief. We filed the brief at like 2 in the afternoon. His article runs on the AP at like 4:30. Hundreds of outlets around the world covering. It just so happens the governor of Puerto Rico is in Washington, D.C. at the time, trying to drum up international investment in Puerto Rico. So he's in D.C., and all of a sudden these headlines, human rights crisis in Puerto Rico, pictures of like horrible images of like the community there suffering, and that night he turns the water back on. I mean, literally, that night he turns the water back on. So the community is laughing. They're like, you know, we can't get a fire truck to come out here after 7 o'clock at night. You know, we can't get 911 services if something serious happens. And this guy's so worried about international investment, they've got people building aqueducts to get the water back here, you know, at midnight. And that was an example of, but that didn't happen because, you know, we had such brilliant legal strategy. In fact, the court never even heard our brief because it was moot, because they got the water turned back on. It's because of the strength of the organizing in the community and the fact that they were essentially the ones who were like, this is the strategy we want to go with. And our position was, we work for you. You're the boss. However you want to do it, that's how we'll do it. Here are your options. You figure it out. So I know I'm running out of time. So I just want to close with the words of the great Cesar Chavez, which certainly remind me, but I think probably remind all of us why we do this work. And I look forward to the conversation and discussion with all of you. Once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. So let us use our time and energy on this planet to serve that goal of social change. Thank you again for your time, and thanks again for inviting me.
I just want to say before we move forward, legal partnerships has been important for us to take back the land. And it's been folks like Chandra's partner, Sunita Patel from the Center for Constitutional Rights, supporting the work that we do. But I'm blessed to have a good friend in the room right now, Jay Kim, who is a graduate of CUNY Law School, who runs a foreclosure clinic with four folks, empowering them to defend themselves. So Jay, stand up. Jay runs an organization with a partner, Karen Gargiamelli, called Common Law NYC, working with folks in New York City. So a big round of applause for Jay. But you know, there's some good folks in the legal community supporting the work and supporting the organizing going on in the ground and really understand the role that each other has in the moment.
The next two things, the next speakers will be Roy J.R. Fleming. We are going to stay on this 5-minute thing. You get a 2-minute warning and then 1 minute. Make sure you, as you do, make your concluding remarks because we want to get everybody in. Thanks, everybody. Roy J.R. Fleming.
As the New York Times Magazine says, the JR stands for just right. As the New York Times Magazine says, I'm not really concerned with the law. You know, we carry a book in our back pocket. Most of the people might campaign, and it's this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know, we consider ourselves an enforcement authority for the people because we tried everything. You know, I stand up here hurt today. Take back the land and sunset. You know, we was in a critical moment, like Max said. You think the funders would have been knocking your door down? Because we tried everything. We tried policy. City government, state government, county government, federal government, United Nations. Nothing happened. We tried the policy route. We tried the traditional organizer route. None of that worked. We didn't try to reinvent a wheel. This was done in the 30s, right, man? During the Civil Rights Movement. Every generation had a role to play in this. But I think what Max keyed in on was the 501c3. You know, during the 30s, the 50s, the 60s, the 80s, and the 90s when they did it, they wasn't dependent on that 501c3. It was people power. The people seized the moment, and they supported it. And the people that was getting money, they supported. Because they understood one thing to be true. Today me, tomorrow you. We still in that moment. Some people think the foreclosure crisis is going down here. True enough, yeah. It's not a crisis right now. But wait till they get into that other ditch that Matt talked about, that they took all the public sector money out. Now they closing clinics, schools, taking people out. What's going to be left? This government has divested in the people. There is no more public sector. I keep hearing people say, what's public sector? There's no more public housing. They're getting rid of public schools, public health facilities. There is no more public sector. Is there any more people in the public? This is my question. Where are the people when all of this is going on? I can testify they wasn't there for Take Back the Land. And a point in time in history when activities of Take Back the Land was needed. At the Anti-Eviction campaign, the local action group would Take Back the Land. We don't ask the government to fund us to fix up houses. We make it clear in every home liberation we do. We don't ask for money from the banks. We don't ask for no money from the government. So we don't expect for no problems from the bank. We don't expect for no problems from the government, right? We ask you for your money. This is the community. It's not the Anti-Eviction campaign doing these activities. We are just promoters. So when people ask me questions like, how do you see the left moving human rights to housing work forward? It's the message. It's the support mechanism. To make sure that these support mechanisms are in place. To make sure that these stories are being told so that the next generation, not our generation, the next generation will inherit something. I don't see us doing this type of activity if it did happen during the 30s, the 50s, the 60s, the 80s. Right? I don't see us taking this type of activity if the generation before us didn't invest their time and resources and providing that platform. A lot of folks talk about the human right to housing. Is it obtainable in America? We shouldn't be looking for what's obtainable. We should be looking for what is needed right now in this place in time, right? We shouldn't be asking for certain things in this point in time. We should be demanding certain things. And we shouldn't be demanding things at press conferences, at forums. We should be demanding these things in the communities that most need these resources, right? Our actions should speak louder than our words. It hurts, that Take Back the Land, messages. Was used by a lot of movements. I actually want to get into that. I'm going to get into it. You know what I'm saying? A lot of people want to get credit sometimes when credit is due. Most of you wouldn't even know who I am if it wasn't for that New York Times magazine cover. Most of the local media didn't say nothing to us for 4 years. We were doing this type of activity. You showed the clip with about 50 microphones out there. One news network carried it, right, Rob? Y'all was in the city for that. One news network. So where do we go from here, right? It's going to take a peer-to-peer system, like we saying with Katrina, Rita, and Sam, to keep movements going, to build movements. We're going to have to learn how to give, put our money where our mouth is. Collective work more than anything is going to be needed. In Chicago, we're starting to reach that point of collective work. We fight for the human right to housing, but people see us everywhere with everybody's support. When our sisters and brother organizations took over mental health clinic, we have support there. When parents at Whittier La Casita in Chicago wanted to take over school, we supported that because we see the connection between education, healthcare, and housing. The one connection we haven't been able to make, and I gotta say this, that they made in every other generation was with the labor community. At a time where they were going to be directly impacted by this foreclosure crisis, their unemployed skillsmen and craftsmen who were losing their home, this was a moment in which labor could have drawn the line, just like they do for Habitat for Humanity. Habitat for Humanity only survives and exists because of what? Their donated labor that they received to keep their projects moving forward. At a time when so many skillsmen were losing their home, this was an opportunity for them to partner up, not just with non-for-profit, community development corporations, grassroots organizations, but partner with the people. We still have an opportunity to do that. Until we unite all our fights and build a collective movement, we'll never obtain a human right to housing, a human right to health care, a human right to education, or a human right to a living wage. Until we unite all our fights with collective work, we're just wasting our time. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jessica with the Right to Housing Alliance in Baltimore. We've been doing work with, initially with homeowners, but also primarily with tenants recently. We've been operating under the Human Right to Housing, Community Control of Land platform, thanks to our interaction with Max early on in our organization. We grew out of an occupier homes group, but unlike a lot of other occupier homes groups, we looked around at the landscape of housing in Baltimore, and as we were driving around to try to target foreclosure filings, we were like, wow, shit's really messed up in between all those houses, what's going on in Baltimore? So we started taking a look, and there's, like everywhere, systemic housing problems going back for decades and decades and decades. And that led us to really strategize about what our objectives are. We were really inspired by some of the direct action tactics and home liberations and eviction defenses of some of the other groups that are doing housing work. But we sort of took the approach that we need to figure out our objectives first and then adapt our tactics to fit those. So we took we unpacked the idea of human rights and what that looks like, and started wondering what does it mean to have the human right to housing? Does that mean, everyone gets housed no matter what? Yes, of course, but really unpacking it, and we sort of, through working with NESRI a little bit and working with United Workers, which is a really, really powerful force of human rights organizing in Baltimore, used these sort of 5 human rights principles to frame what we're doing, and that's participation, accountability, transparency, equity, and universality. And really looking at what it takes to achieve those things in Baltimore. We want our tactics to actually, whatever tactics we're using, we want them to actually be pushing for those things specifically. So we have been using a model that, if you're familiar with City Life Vida Urbana, and talking about the legal work along with community organizing, this sort of uses the model of having legal strategies incorporated with grassroots organizing strategies, having them support each other, because we know that the legal system can't solve all the problems. We know that community organizing needs the support of legal services to be stronger, to reassure members, to have a sort of safety network there, but also to use the privilege of the legal system. But we think there's a third component that we need to add to that, and that's a political education component. And we think that, like Max was saying, this idea of, when you do a home liberation, you win someone a principal reduction, and you're giving them essentially a piece of property that they're like, oh, sweet, thanks, see you later. We're thinking the only way that we can combat that is to have this education piece in place, that when people go into these home liberations, when people go into these eviction defenses, they have an analysis about capitalism. They have an analysis about the commodification of housing and how it's a problem, and are starting to explore some of these alternatives like community land trusts. So going into the tactics, we're actually building a movement of people who are involved more than just to save their own personal piece of property, because we think that's one of the biggest challenges that a lot of the groups working around housing have been dealing with, is not really making a connection to a larger struggle, except for the action component. So we really think, the sword and shield is kind of like the sword and the shield in the book. And those 3 really need to go together, because without the education component, without a really strong political education and leadership development program, that the tactics are just kind of lost. The tactics are just going to sort of fall short every time. So to that end, I want to let Detrese take over to talk just for a second about one of the ways that we're trying to intervene in our sort of rental market crisis in Baltimore, where we had 150,000 landlord-tenant complaints filed last year, mostly for non-payment, in a city of 600,000 people. That's a quarter of the people in our city who are dealing with the lack of affordable housing and substandard conditions. It's really just become a debt collection service for landlords. There's no opportunity for the tenants to participate in the process. They're really just, the judges hear the complaint and say, did you pay your rent? And they're like, no, but I have mold. And the judge doesn't want to hear that. They just want to get him out. They call it the rocket docket, because it's up to 600 people a day going through rent court. Sorry, but I'm going to let this over to Detrese to talk a little bit about what can happen in rent court when we bring people together to work on these problems.
Hello, I'm actually a tenant that's dealing with poor property management. And so this is what inspired me to join Right to Housing Alliance. My landlord recently filed an eviction case against me, and I explained to the landlord, the judge, I didn't dispute the charges. However, my landlord has been charging me illegal late fees, and he also didn't have the lead pay certification number on the court docket, which the judge dismissed my case and many other people's cases that day. And by me standing up, I also inspired the tenants in my community to stand up and join together to stop this property management from charging us illegal late fees, and also fix things that needs to get fixed in our apartments and our houses or whatever. So this is why I'm here today.
I want to say a little more about what happened in court that day, which was that she didn't contest the charges, but wanted the opportunity to say in front of a judge that there are these illegal fees, and it's this total racket. The landlord's using this opportunity by taking people to court the day that they're late to get them into court so they can charge not only the legally allowed fees through court, but also these secondary agent fees. Like, you know, they pay the court fees and then they go back to the property manager, there are these additional fees. And this is a racket over hundreds and hundreds of properties and tenants dealing with this. And getting it on record, just in front of the court with all these other tenants there, really galvanized that everyone's dealing with the same problems. Like, there are hundreds of people in court at the same time that don't recognize that they're not the only one going through it, and that really galvanized for a lot of the other tenants that are there to hear it, that we need to come together to work on these problems. So that was a really, one person standing up just for their rights in court, and we pulled the docket, but we haven't looked at the numbers. It's somewhere between 50 and 180 cases that were dismissed that day because of the case.
Toussaint Losier.
All right, so I'm gonna do my best to keep things short because I really want to see us get into the question and answer portion of the program, because I think it's always one of the more interesting aspects of these types of gatherings, and time and time again we sort of get into it, and there's like 15 minutes left. 20 people want to get the questions answered, and maybe we only get to a handful. I want to touch on a couple of things that I thought have been particularly inspiring about Take Back the Land, because I think we in Chicago have benefited more recently from a fair amount of the national spotlight in terms of the work that we've been doing. And a lot of that comes out of the history of the Western Cape Anti-Eviction campaign, the struggles against neoliberal policies that have been taking place in South Africa since the turn of the 21st century, and also comes out of the experience of folks who came out of public housing in Chicago, particularly Cabrini Green, brought with them out of the struggles to preserve public housing there. But we in Chicago also benefited a lot from the interactions that we had with folks who Take Back the Land, different opportunities when Max came, and other folks who Take Back the Land came and sort of spoke with us, both sort of like public lecture style such as this, and also more private kind of strategy conversation. And it's really that dialogue that we had both locally in Chicago and then just sort of more broadly in terms of having a sense of being part of the network of organizations that were wrestling these issues. They really helped to push us to do what we now talk about regularly as enforcing the human right to housing, and doing that by moving homeless families into what we like to call homeless homes, right? And that's something that came out of the organizing that we were already doing and kind of developed somewhat organically out of the histories of struggle that we brought to the table, but I think also came out of that interaction with Take Back the Land. So if we could offer the folks who have been at the forefront of organizing Take Back the Land a round of applause one more time. And just two quick points that I want to highlight that seem to be really salient kind of takeaways from just what Take Back the Land has been able to do is that one, it surprised me, and Rob spoke to this earlier, it surprised me that when Take Back the Land was really looking to make connections with organizations around the country, that the folks who were most interested in gravitating to what Take Back the Land was doing were in places like, thank you, Rochester, New York, and it certainly, you can just wait for the end of the
Sir, stop. Come on. Sir, don't take his flyer, please. You're out of order.
That sort of activity popped up in places that those of us from Chicago or more prominent cities consider to be random places out in the middle of, like Rochester, New York, and Madison, Wisconsin. And I think part of what that shows is that the issues that we might be wrestling with in more prominent places are also really tangible in smaller cities as well. And I think one of the things that those of us who like to organize in, say, the housing sector don't think about enough is how do we make connections with people who are struggling around the same sort of issues, but are doing so in cities that have less prominence, and also offer some degree of opportunity because there's less of a crowded field in terms of the number of organizations there, right? And so particularly young people who are looking to find an opportunity to plug into some of this work and take it forward might not have as easy an opportunity in terms of finding a place to fit in. So I think there's a lot of potential for groups that are doing this sort of work, whether it's housing or in other areas, to look at, to adapt almost like a sort of reverse Walmart style of organizing in terms of saying what does it look like to do some of this work in the Arkansas and the small towns in Missouri, aside from just the Chicago, New York, what have you. The other thing that I think is also worth speaking to some degree is just from my own perspective, having worked with social movements in South Africa, to find it pretty inspiring when you can work with organizations that are not preoccupied with what the grant funding cycle looks like, how to plan for the site visit, right? Things of that nature to sort of try and say, okay, we're going to kind of give our middle finger to the nonprofit industrial complex, and we're going to just do the work that needs to be done. And I think it's a great spirit to come to the work with, and it's essential in a lot of ways because it's something that globally is really the norm, right? And here is an aberration in a lot of ways. But at the same time, doing the work takes money, right? And it takes resources. And for those of us who want to say we want to take back the land and we want to put homeless people in people's homes, we can do that without a salary to some degree, but we need to be able to find ways to fund the locks, the doors, the fixtures, the copper that's been ripped out, the pipes, all those things. And those take resources. And we have to figure out ways to fund that sort of work, particularly work that's at the cutting edge, because I can borrow money from some friends to get gas, or I can take time out of my day to organize other folks to go canvas, but it's another story entirely to say, okay, if we're going to make this home that's already been stripped habitable for people to live in, how are we going to go about having the money, the resources to be able to do that? So I think there's also questions in terms of, well, not new questions, but there are questions that need to be revisited in terms of how do we rely not simply on foundations, but engage different ways of being able to raise the money to do the work that needs to happen, right? And I think one of the things that we found is that there's opportunities to do that, but there's also a lot of difficulty as well in terms of, say, how do you operate outside of the traditional 501c3 structure, and then also be able to make some progress if you can only access some of the opportunities that come with that to a limited degree, right? Is that it? Or 1 minute? Okay. So the last thing I want to say is I just really want to emphasize what the folks from Baltimore were sharing in terms of marrying the sword and the shield with the book, right? Because I think it's really essential that those of us who are trying to take on or move in the direction of some sort of transformative organizing, right? Organizing that's not simply focused on, okay, we need to take home a particular victory, or we need to take home a bill that gets passed or some sort of change of policy, but we want to do it in a way that transforms not only what our communities look like, but the way in which people think about issues of housing, issues of work, things of that nature, that we also really get more serious and rigorous about what we're doing in terms of political education and leadership development. And I think those are things that at this moment in time, a lot of organizations either don't do or they pay lip service to. And to really do a more rigorous job of pushing that forward and trying to get as good at that. We in Chicago have a lot of work to do in terms of getting as good as we can at doing that, as we are at finding a house, scouting it, breaking into it, allegedly, right? Cleaning it up and making it happen for families. We also need to be as, and we do a fairly good job of criticizing ourselves at how long it takes us to do it, right? At how we could always do it better. We also need to do a better job of pushing ourselves to do a better job of informing the folks that we're working with that, okay, we're gonna do what we can to enforce human rights housing, right? Keep people from getting evicted, but at the same time, we need to sit down and study, okay, when we talk about human rights, what does that mean, right? When we talk about going to the Senate court, what does that mean? Why are you paying rent in the first place, right? How is it that the structures of ownership of property operate in the way that you do? When you pay rent to a landlord, is that money really going to, cleaning up your house, or are you just paying your landlord's mortgage? Like things of that nature are just the sort of the surface of the sort of conversations that we need to have, and we always need to do a better job of pushing those conversations forward. So thank you.
So thank you so much for commenting. Even organized, so I hope it's okay to let Max and Rob get the last moment, and if you're interested in the book, please come up and talk to me.
Thank you, Aaron. I really appreciate everybody being here on such a miserable night. This is, I don't know how I feel right now, right? I'm going through a little bit of a tough time. This has been a part of me for 4 years. I know it's been a part of Max for a better part of 7 years. I don't think we're going anywhere. We'll still be thinking and doing the work and working with a lot of the folks. But I'm gonna just touch on two pieces: the political education piece, because I think sometimes people got to figure out where they are. I keep getting told you got to meet people where they're at, right? So some stuff happened to me, and I started unpacking that American dream nonsense. And I was like, the American dream, you got your foot on your neck, and I'm trying to achieve something. As people of color, I look back at my dad getting a predatory loan out on Long Island, being moved in a certain neighborhood, and struggling and working 18 hours a day to pay that mortgage, right? But meanwhile, he's a failure if he doesn't achieve the American dream. You know what? The American dream is bullshit, right? And I don't need to buy it. Right? So I'll say that there's a lot of falseness to that. And I think people have to come to a certain place. But I want to speak to, and before you leave, I want to speak real quickly about properties. In August 2011, I received an email from a writer at Credit.com. I won't reveal his name, but Credit.com was a real right-wing blog. But this writer said something is wrong here, and he had received an email from Bank of America exposing the fact that the federal government reached out to financial institutions with 254 foreclosed properties and said, we're writing to you for a request for information. If we gave these properties to you, what would you do with it? And he thought it was morally wrong, somebody from the right. And he had met a friend of mine named Dina Levy, and she put him in contact with me. This guy wrote me back and said, this is not right, so I'm going to give you this email. I wrote out to the rest of the movement around the country. Nobody wanted to step up and do anything about it, right? So there's a problem with the quote-unquote movement that we have in this country, or lack thereof, with respect to housing. Again, I would call out individual organizations or alliances and coalitions, but that's not what this is about. but there is a lot of bullshit out there under the guise of organizing, building a base, and moving towards social change from a left to transformative way of thinking.